are jumping in today on it's our Thursday summer series. So we are covering our car forms library, and we are going to dive in on the SIP, which is the seller in possession, and the RLAS, which is the residential lease after sale. So both of those are for when the seller stays in possession of the property until after the close of escrow, or after the close of escrow, not until after, but after the close of escrow, and it's there to protect the buyer. Keep in mind that when your buyer takes on a seller in that capacity, they've now become a landlord. So it's not always ideal. However, I can safely say that in all of my years doing real estate and doing sellers in possession after the close of escrow, I've never had a seller stay longer than what was negotiated. So I've never had a problem with the seller moving out. Usually they've got another property in contract. They've got, whatever, there's something specific going on that allows them to move forward and get closed. So we always are looking for them to move out. I've never had an issue with it. Doesn't mean you won't ever have an issue. I just haven't at this point. So I'm just throwing that out there. That there's always that issue. So we will go over both of these forms, and I'll also show you in the contract where you would find it. So again, it's the SIP, the SIP form, seller in possession after the close of escrow, and the residential lease after sale. And let me show you here. Let me find the residential purchase agreement listing. I'm sure it's in here someplace. Or maybe not. All right. So let me pull up the California. These are all referenced in the residential purchase agreement, is where you make these designations. And this would be, you would utilize these forms if you were having a conversation with the listing agent and the listing agent said, yes, like we would like to close as soon as possible, but my sellers can't move out until a specific day, or they need like 10 days after the close of escrow or 3 days after the close of escrow to remain in the property. Then I just took it out of my thing. Then I was trying to close the window. Yeah. All right. Then you would go into your residential purchase agreement and you would negotiate that as part of the purchase of the home. If that works for your buyers, you don't have to. Just because the seller needs it doesn't mean you have to include it. Also, it depends, right, on like how many offers you have already in on that property and how competitive you're trying to be. It could make a difference on how you decide to treat that transaction and how you decide to write it up in the purchase agreement. Hold on, I'm just trying to move all of the forms up into my transaction, and I keep double clicking. All right, I'm not good at clicking. All right, so on your residential purchase agreement, you have all the blanket forms at the beginning, and then we get to the actual residential purchase agreement into the grid. And when we enter into the grid, it's going to talk about time of possession. Section M is the possession. And it talks about, hey, when are we accessing the property upon notice of recordation at 6 p.m. on a certain date and time, or as specified in 3M2 or the attached TOPA. So, right, so if the seller is going to remain in possession after the close of escrow, we would just leave this at the default, and then we would come down here. Well, you would actually check this box here, 6 p.m. or blank AM PM on the date specified is applicable as 3M2 or the attached TOPA. Here is 3M2, seller occupied or vacant units, close of escrow date or checked below. So, right, so it defaults to the close of escrow date, or you would check blank days after close of escrow or blank days after close of escrow. So the reason there's 2 lines here is one is for 29 days or less. So less than 30 days, you would check the first box and you would fill in how many days, 27, 29, whatever it might be. The second one option is for 30 or more days. So if it's going to be 30 days after the close of escrow, we put in 30, or it may be 60 or 42 or whatever it might be. If it's 30 or more, it goes in the second box. And the reason that is is that the seller in possession form, the SIP form, is only good until day 29 after the close of escrow. If it's going to be 30 or more days, we're going to use that RLAS form, or that residential lease after sale. Does anybody have questions about that section in the RPA? All right. And as always, if you have questions, I do have the chat box open, or you can raise your little hand, or you can just feel free to interrupt me. Anything works. The SIP form, the seller in possession after the close of escrow, is the shortest and simplest form. So whenever possible, try to keep your sellers in possession to 29 days or less. Legally, it also makes it an easier deal. And the seller to remain in possession is like 2 pages, where the RLAS is like 27 pages. Okay, it's probably not actually that long, but it is long. So just kind of know that it's a little simpler that way for the 29 days or less. So what I like to do is, somebody needs a, 90 days in the property from the date that we enter into contract, is maybe make a longer purchase agreement time frame, and then so we stay within those 29 days, or adjust it. But as a listing agent, I always like to get it closed sooner rather than later. And you're going to take it on a case by case basis. If it's super competitive, right, there's multiple offers involved, then we may let the seller remain in possession of the property after the close of escrow for free or for a low cost, versus if it's not super competitive and the sellers need time, we may charge them for that time. The average cost that gets charged to a seller is the buyer's PITI. That'd be their principal, interest, taxes, and insurance, is usually what we negotiate in if we're going to ask the seller to pay for it. And what that means is that we're actually asking the seller to pay for the buyer's payment for the portion the remaining in the property. That helps the buyer offset the cost, because oftentimes they're still renting a property while the seller's remaining in possession. So they're accumulating this payment on their mortgage and they are paying rent still. So that helps. Now, ultimately for your buyers, just so everybody knows, when they close on a property, like today is the 15th of June, if we were closing on a property today, their first payment, your buyer's first payment, would not be July 1st. Their first payment would not be until August 1st. So if the sellers remained in possession after the close of escrow for 3 weeks, taking it into the first week of July, the buyers pay rent for June. They may pay rent for July or partial rent, but they don't actually have a mortgage payment due until August. So they don't have a double payment. So just kind of keep that in mind as you're trying to decide how much you're going to charge a seller, or if you're going to charge a seller, or if you're not going to charge a seller, is that there's always this month. And the reason that is because when you close on a property, if we close today on June 15th, you're accumulating and paying your interest as part of your closing costs for the month of June. So you'll see on your closing statement, there's prorated interest in the amount of 15 days for that they're paying as part of their closing costs. Okay. What happens come July 1st is interest starts accruing on the loan, and they don't pay that interest that accrues in July until that August 1st payment. So that August 1st payment, they pay any interest that accrued in the month of July and part of the principal. And then they also pay their portion of the, taxes and insurance divided by 12 months, their impound account. So that's kind of the thought process there. Does anybody have any questions on that or how that works? All right. So your seller to remain in possession addendum, it's the SIP form SIP. This was one of those forms that was just revised well, it wasn't just revised, it was revised last year. So it was the last time this form was revised, 6/22. Although I feel like there were some revisions coming out this month, but maybe not. This is an addendum to the purchase agreement, right? Is usually what it's an addendum to. It may be a seller counter offer or a buyer counter offer. So, right. So there's some different options there, or other. And then you want to make sure you put that date in here. This would be the date that's listed if it's a purchase agreement, the printed date on the upper left-hand corner of the first page of the residential purchase agreement. You make sure you have the property address in there, the buyer's names, and the seller's names. Let's put some buyers in here. Buyer 1, buyer 2. All right. And then we have seller 1 and seller 2. This is an addendum. This addendum is intended to grant the seller a license to remain in possession of and use the property after the close of escrow. So, well, anyways, it is intended for short-term occupancy. If the close of escrow happens at 9 a.m. and you've given the seller permission on the residential purchase agreement to stay in the property until 8 p.m. or 9 p.m. or 10 p.m. on the date of the close of escrow, you don't need this because it's still on the date of the close of escrow. You might not be getting keys upon notice of recordation, but it's still the date of the close of escrow. So if it's on the day that you're recording, just after you're anticipated to get the recording notification, you don't need to do one of these forms. So this is going to be like after that day, just for the record. It is intended for short-term occupancy, 29 days or less. If occupancy is intended to be for 30 days or longer, parties are advised to use the residential lease after sale, regardless of the length of time of possession. Buyers advised to consult with a qualified local landlord attorney to discuss whether possession could be interpreted as creating a landlord-tenant relationship between buyer and seller. Note, local rent control and other law regarding tenants' rights may impact the buyers and sellers' rights and obligations. Close of escrow day shall be day 0 for the purpose of counting days for the term of this license to remain in possession, right? So close of escrow becomes day 0. The next day is day 1, 2, 3, 4. We count every day, okay? Any questions about that top section? All right, number 1, the term. The seller is granted a license to remain in possession of property for blank calendar days after the close of escrow is the default. You're going to fill in the calendar days, or you may have, like, maybe it's 15 days after the close of escrow, or you could put in a specific date here. So you could check this box and put that they can remain in possession until June 30th, right? Until 6 p.m. is the default. Again, we can change that. So if you wanted them to be out at 10 a.m. or maybe you were giving them until 11:59 p.m., whatever that might be, you can fill that in there. Otherwise, it defaults to 6 p.m. Seller has no right to remain in possession beyond the term and may be responsible for court-awarded damages if seller does remain. Okay, so there's the term. Any questions about number 1? All right, consideration. In consideration for the seller agreeing to sell and the buyer to sell to the buyer and the buyer agreeing to allow seller to remain in possession after the close of escrow, seller agrees to pay buyer a non-refundable license fee for the term specified in paragraph 1 of blank per day or blank. So, right, so we could fill in, this is where if we figured out the buyer's PITI, we would take their total payment. Maybe it was $3,000. And we're going to divide it by 30. When we prorate things in real estate contracts, we always do it by 30 days, regardless if we're in February or July or June. It doesn't matter. It's 30 days. Okay, right? February has less. July has more. June has 30. It's always 30. So if their payment was $3,000 divided by 30, it would be $100 per day is what we could fill in there. Or we may negotiate a flat rate, which over here we could check this box and we could put in that they're going to pay $1,500 for the term of the license to remain in possession. Okay, so those are your 2 options there. This is where you could also put at no cost. Okay, if you weren't going to charge them for that time remaining in possession. Seller shall deposit such funds with escrow holder prior to the close of escrow, or such funds shall be withdrawn from seller's proceeds. At close of escrow, all consideration will be released to buyer is the default. Just so you guys know, I'm not a fan of this, it automatically being released to the buyer. Although for the consideration, it generally doesn't matter. So keep in mind that if we give the seller license to remain in possession at a cost, let's put it at $100 per day until June 30th, this says that, hey, whether they stay through June 30th or whether they leave on June 20th, the buyer still gets that full through, it's going to end up being $1,500 because I said the close of escrow was on the 15th and they're staying in possession until the 30th. So it's 15 days. They're going to get $1,500 total. Those funds go directly to the buyer. There's no refund. So if they move out sooner, buyer still gets the total amount of the funds. Okay. So it doesn't matter if that gets released to the buyer or not, unless you're going to set it up where it's just the prorated number of days used. So just kind of keep that in mind in your head. We'll talk about that here in a minute. So seller shall deposit funds with escrow holder prior to the close of escrow, or such funds shall be withheld from seller's proceeds. At close of escrow, all consideration will be released to buyer, or we check this box here if we want it to be held in escrow. So if there's a flat rate that's all going to the buyer, it doesn't matter. Release it to the buyer right away, or you can hold it in escrow. Okay, if it's going to be prorated, I recommend holding it in escrow so you're not trying to get money back from a buyer. If seller vacates the property prior to the end of the term in paragraph 1 up here, no portion of the consideration will be returned to the seller unless otherwise agreed to in writing. So that's a really important part of that paragraph. That's what I was talking about, that the whole amount gets released to the buyer, whether they use 1 day or all 15 days. Okay, unless we put it in writing elsewhere. Late charge or NSF, non-sufficient fund checks. If any payment from the seller to buyer is required outside of escrow and such payment is not received by buyer within 5 days after date due, seller shall pay buyer an additional sum of blank as a late charge. And if a check is returned for non-sufficient funds, NSF, seller shall pay buyer $25 as an NSF charge. Seller and buyer agree that these charges represent fair and reasonable estimate of costs buyers may incur by reason of seller's late or NSF payment. Buyer's acceptance of any late charge or NSF fee shall not constitute a waiver as to any default by the seller. So you probably want to fill something in here just so it's filled in so that you've got an amount. What's that late fee that seller is going to pay if any funds are required outside the close of escrow? What does that look like?
I have a question about the last one, letter A, 2A. So you said unless, so, you know, they were to get paid the $1,500 regardless, whether they stayed 1 day or the full 15 days, unless it's in writing. Is there a section on this that says like other that you could write something in, or would it have to be a different?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yep. There's, you know, our California, our car association forms are really good at putting that other line. So we'll talk about that here at the bottom.
Gotcha.
But yeah, absolutely. It does default to a $25 non-sufficient charge or funds charge fee of $25 because that's legally what you're allowed to do on the first NSF fee in California. So just so you know, they have updated it with that dollar amount there because that's on the first NSF charge that you get hit by a customer or a client or a tenant or whatever. $25 is the max that you can charge them for the NSF. It goes up after the second, but that's why it's got $25 pre-printed in there and you can't change that. Any other questions on section 2, consideration or the late charge / NSF? All right. Section 3 is seller's obligation for condition of property. Maintenance. The seller shall maintain the property, including pool, spa, landscaping, and grounds, and all personal property included in the sale in this substantially the same condition as on the date of acceptance of the agreement or is modified by the agreement, except as provided in the agreement. Seller shall not make any alterations to the property without buyer's written consent, right? So whatever was in that contract of the date of acceptance, the residential purchase agreement, the seller's supposed to deliver that property in that same condition as the date of acceptance on the date they deliver possession after the seller in possession. So same thing. If the lawn was mowed, lawn should be mowed. Everything should continue to be watered. Pool shall be maintained. If the fridge was negotiated as part of the contract and it was in working order, the fridge should still be working when they deliver possession. Okay, pretty simple there. Maintenance. Delivery of possession. Seller shall deliver the property in the condition and on the terms provided in the agreements. Okay, so they're going to deliver the property in the terms in this agreement. Delivery of possession fee. In addition to the license fee specified in paragraph 2, seller agrees to deposit with escrow holder or such fund shall be withheld from the seller's proceeds a delivery of possession fee in the amount of blank dollars. This is kind of like a deposit. Okay, for the sake of the rental, this is kind of like a deposit. Saying that, hey, the seller is going to deliver the property in the condition it was supposed to be delivered in, and they're going to vacate the property by a specific date in order to get this money back. So usually in here, I usually put in somewhere between $2,000 or $3,000. Okay. If there was quite a bit of like personal property negotiated as part of the sale, I might increase it to cover that cost in the case they decide to take the fridge with them, or I think they're shady, or whatever it might be. Generally speaking, the default on this one is at the close of escrow funds, or at the close of escrow, this fee will be released to the buyer. I really prefer that this get held in escrow. Again, it's really hard to get money back from a buyer. So like this fee up here, the consideration, if the whole amount's going to the buyer, release it to the buyer right away. There's no sense in anybody arguing over that consideration down the road. But I would oftentimes leave this deposit held in escrow. I want it to just be sitting there in escrow so we can fight over it that way. Okay, most of the time you don't have to fight over it, just for the record. I've only fought over this money once or twice. Within 5 days after delivery of possession to buyer, buyer shall return the delivery of possession fee to seller if the property was delivered to buyer in the conditions specified in paragraphs 3A and B and on the date specified in paragraph 1, right? So there's no ifs, ands, or buts. It's clarified there. That's why you should do your agent visual inspection disclosure as close to the accepted offer as possible, and make sure you take pictures and include it so that you have a visual record of what the condition of the property actually was. Okay, keep in mind that in no point does it talk about that the property needs to be professionally cleaned or anything. So the possession should be delivered just like it should be in the residential purchase agreement, which is swept clean. Okay, so sellers should like remove all their debris and personal belongings, but there's no requirement that they actually truly clean the property. Okay, you shouldn't have giant hairballs from their dogs or poo sitting around in the backyard. That would be debris. But they don't have to have it professionally cleaned or landscaped. Okay. Any questions about section 3 there? Seller's obligations for condition of property and that delivery of possession fee. All right, the next one is utilities. Seller agrees to pay for all utilities and any related utility services and the following charges. So for the most part, you don't often fill in anything there. They're just sellers agreeing to pay for. We're not going to transfer utilities over into the buyer's name until that date that they're supposed to provide possession to the property. Okay, seller takes care of everything prior to that time.
Question. So
yes.
do we let our sellers know, hey, you could just turn off your PG&E before you're about to leave?
Yeah, so
or just have them cut off the last day they're there?
Yeah, so any seller, whether they're staying in possession or they're delivering possession at the close of escrow, about 2 weeks in advance, they can go in there and schedule those utilities to be turned off on the date that they're going to deliver possession to those buyers. So it doesn't matter whether they're in possession or not. Whenever they're handing keys to the buyers, that's when they can cancel their utilities. Absolutely. And they can usually pre-schedule that. Just in following charges except, so which shall be paid for by the buyer. So this last line is if something's going to be paid for by the buyer, it would go in that except line down here at the bottom of number 4. Entry, a seller shall make property available to buyer for the purposes of entering to make necessary or agreed repairs or to supply necessary or agreed services or to show property to prospective or actual purchasers, tenants, mortgagees, lenders, appraisers, or contractors. Buyer and seller agree that 24-hour notice, oral or written, shall be reasonable and sufficient notice. In an emergency, buyer may enter property anytime without prior notice. Buyer may not move personal property into property without prior written consent from the seller. So this just is setting up just like a regular tenant relationship, right? 24-hour notice, the buyer has the right to access the property for any reason, ultimately, that they deem necessary. Keep in mind that it gets ugly really quick if the buyer starts trying to do work on the interior of the property as the seller's trying to finish up and move out. So it does cause some complications there. If they're like, well, the contractor's going to come and start tearing out the floors and the sellers are still living there, bad idea. So just have a conversation with your buyers about that before you negotiate the seller in possession. Usually I set it up with, that the seller's going to remain in possession and you aren't going to get keys to that property or be able to really access it until the date that they move out, even though this says otherwise, just because that tends to keep it a little friendlier and everybody a little happier that way. Any questions about number 5 or 4 or 3 or 2 or 1? All right, number 6 is keys and other items included. The seller shall provide keys and other necessary items necessary to access the property as required in the agreement at the close of escrow, or if checked at the end of the term of the seller license to remain in possession. Just so you know, usually on my seller in possession, I usually check this box that, hey, all the keys and the remotes and everything are going to get provided to the buyer at the time that the seller actually delivers possession, not at the close of escrow. I've actually had it cause some problems in the past with the buyers having keys before. They forget, I don't know, they feel like they have a right to go in the property whenever their little heart's desire. So usually I check the box there that you'll get keys and stuff at the close of escrow. Just personal preference there. But the default is that they're going to get them at close of escrow, not at delivery of possession. So I usually delivery of possession. Other items included in the agreement shall be provided at the end of the term of the seller license to remain in possession. Just meaning like if a fridge or patio furniture or washer and dryer was negotiated, they're going to get those items when the seller delivers possession. They're going to leave those behind. Okay. Any questions about number 6? Assignment and subletting is number 7. The seller shall not assign or sublet any or all or any part of the property, or assign or transfer this license to remain in possession of the property, any agreement, subletting, or transfer of the property by voluntary act of the seller in operation of law or otherwise without buyer's prior written consent, shall give the buyer the right to terminate the seller's license to remain in possession, right? We're giving the seller the right to remain in property, not rent it out temporarily as a short-term rental or bring extra people in or anything like that. So that's what 7 clarifies. Insurance, seller's personal property, including vehicles, is not insured by the buyer and, if applicable, not by the owner's association against loss or damage due to fire, theft, vandalism, rain, water, criminal, or neglect acts of others, or any other cause. Seller is advised to carry seller's own insurance to protect the seller from such loss and to contact its own insurance carrier to discuss available options. The seller should contact their insurance carrier if you're representing the seller and the seller is remaining in possession. On the date of the close of escrow, the seller should reach out to their insurance agent and say, hey, we have sold the house. However, we're renting the house back from the buyer for the next 2 weeks. Can we transfer the policy over to a rental policy, right? They should talk to their insurance agent and make sure they have the coverage appropriate for that. And same thing with a buyer. They may want to talk to their insurance agent and make sure that they're covered on their insurances as well. Okay. Waiver, the waiver or breach, the waiver of any breach shall not be construed as continuing waiver of the same or any subsequent breach. Just legal jargon there. Other terms, conditions, and supplements. This may be where you would put that phrase that we were talking about, like Maciel mentioned, where it may be like, we're going to say, hold on, we're going to come back up here and put license fee to be prorated based on actual days seller remains in property. Right. So something like that, just to make sure that if you wanted that to be prorated, so if they moved out early, they only pay for the days actually used, that would be a great place to put it, would be down here on this other terms, conditions, and supplements. Okay. You could also put anything else there. You may want to identify if there's going to be pets on the property or something like that, or whatever it might be. If the seller already had like another tenant in the property when you purchased the home, right? Like the seller was living there with a roommate, you may want to identify this on the other terms and conditions as well, like seller to remain in possession, as well as current roommates also may remain, because it clearly states that they can't do that. However, they were doing that before we negotiated this. So you may want to just clarify that to make sure that the full thing is understood of what's going on in the property after the close of escrow. Regardless of the length of time for possession, as originally agreed, if buyer and seller intend to extend this SIP beyond 29 days from close of escrow, buyer and seller are advised to consult with a qualified local landlord-tenant attorney regarding whether a landlord-tenant relationship may be inadvertently created. By signing below, buyer and seller acknowledge that each has read, understand, and received a copy of and agrees to the terms of this seller license to remain in possession addendum. Just so you know, ultimately your agency relationship terminates at the close of escrow, not when the seller delivers possession. And so there's very limited things that we can do or get involved with if this does not work out right, outside of just helping to get deposits or the funds released from escrow. Like that's totally on us. But outside of that, it's hard for us to get too involved, although we usually try just a little bit. So just be careful with that. Any questions about the seller's license to remain in possession after the close of escrow form? If you're thinking, man, Amy, that seems pretty complicated, just wait until we get to the residential lease after sale. This one's the simple one. And it's really not that bad, right? We're just going to put in the term, what the consideration is, the late charge, and then the deposit, and whether they're going to be held in escrow or released. That's really all that's on this form. The rest of it's just kind of legal jargon. All right.
People usually put a higher late charge than the 25 NSFE, like how you put 150, or what is that usually?
Yeah, so this would be like, hey, if they're late, like we negotiated, right? We're coming up on the end of the 29 days, and the sellers want to stay longer and the buyers want to allow them to stay longer. So they're supposed to, this is now being handled outside of escrow. They're going to pay the buyer an extra $2,000 to stay another 20 days or whatever. And then they don't deliver that payment by the 1st of July or the 30th of June. Then if it's 5 days late, so it'd be like July 5th, now they would owe an additional $150 late fee. You could make it more. I usually put it somewhere around there. Most of the time, I think I've only had them negotiate funds outside of escrow, like on one occasion. Two, I can think of two. And it was probably the same buyers that were negotiating additional time on both sides of the transaction. Anyways, when they sold the property. So that would just be that. You cannot change the NSF fee. That just is what it is. It's by state law. That's the max that you can charge them for insufficient funds.
Gotcha. I misread that. I thought the NSF fee you changed to 150, but it was like if they're late, this is the charge that you're charging them for being late. Got it.
Yeah. I usually kind of think about like if I pay my mortgage late, what does my mortgage pay me or charge me? And it's usually somewhere in that like 125 to 150 range. So I think like a lender. That's how I came up with 150 in case anybody was wondering. All right. Moving on to the residential lease after sale, seller in possession after the close of escrow. This is intended for possession of 30 days or more. Remember, day 0 starts on the date of the close of escrow. We count from there. You're going to make sure you put in today's date on this, seller 1, seller 2, and buyer, right? So now the seller has become the tenant and the buyer has become the housing provider, right? Or the landlord, but we don't use landlord anymore. We use housing provider. They have entered into a purchase agreement for real property described below. Close of escrow for the purchase agreement is scheduled to occur on blank date. So if it was today, we would put in today's date, whatever that scheduled close of escrow date is. Buyer as the housing provider and seller as the tenant agree as follows, the agreement. Property, the housing provider rents to tenant and tenant rents from housing provider. The real property and improvements described as, and this is where you're going to put the property address. That becomes the premises. The premises are for the sole use of personal residence by the following named persons only. This is where you're going to put their names. So you would be like the sellers and immediate immediate. Apparently I can't spell immediate. It's all right though.
I think it's 2 M's.
I think so too. All right, immediate family member. I spelled it so bad it didn't even correct it for me. Members, MEMBRS only, right? So usually I put like immediate family members only, and I put the seller's name. So whatever, like seller 1 and seller 2 and immediate family members. But this would be like if they had an existing roommate that was going to stay with them, that's where you'd put that in. Or maybe their parents are staying with them. They live in the property. This is where you would clarify who's going to be in the property. Any person in the premise other than those listed on this paragraph are considered guests. Guests are not permitted to stay more than 14 days without a housing provider's written consent. You might want to change that and be like, hey, you can't stay more than one night or maybe 2 days, right? Without housing provider's written consent. They may have like, family coming into town to help them move. So maybe it's a weekend, who knows? So, but the default there is 14 days without prior written consent. Okay. The personal property listed in the purchase agreement maintained pursuant to paragraph 11 is included, right? So if it was negotiated as part of the purchase contract, it's staying, the sellers still have the ability to use those items until they deliver possession, is what that's stating. Any questions about section 1? Section 2, the term. The term begins on the day after close of escrow on the purchase and sale agreement, the commencement date, and shall terminate blank calendar days after close of escrow or on a specific date at 6 p.m., right? So if we leave it at the default, we need to fill in calendar days. So maybe they're staying for 42 calendar days after close of escrow at 6 p.m. That's when it terminates. Okay. Or again, we could put a specific date here rather than days. So maybe it's terminating on July 31st. And maybe it's going to terminate at 10 a.m. instead of 6 p.m. So you can go in there and change that all up, whatever makes you happy. But it's only going to count as one. So the default is days, but as soon as we check this box, then it goes to a specific date. You really only want to fill one or the other in and not both. The tenant shall vacate the premises upon termination of this agreement unless the housing provider and tenant have signed a new agreement mandated by any rent increase cap or just cause eviction control under state or local laws, or housing provider accepts rent from tenant other than past due rent, in which case a month-to-month tenancy shall be created, which either party may terminate pursuant to California Civil Code. Rent shall be at a rate agreed by housing provider and tenant or as allowed by law. All other terms and conditions in this agreement shall remain in full force and effect, right? So with any tenant landlord relationship, or sorry, tenant housing provider relationship, if my lease is scheduled to end at the end of June and I say, oh, here's another $2,000 for July, and the housing provider accepts that $2,000 and puts it in their account, cashes that check, that's now creating another month-to-month relationship for the next month, even without a signed agreement in place, just so you're aware of that. You can collect past due, but you can't collect future without creating a new agreement. It automatically creates a new agreement. Okay, any questions about number 2, the term? Escrow payments is number 3. Check all that apply. What's going to be withheld from escrow? You've got security deposit, first month's rent, rent for the entire lease term if lease term is at least 6 months, or other. Per escrow instructions shall be paid out of seller's proceeds from the escrow for the purchase of the premises, right? So this is what's going to be paid out of the seller's proceeds. Generally speaking, it's like security deposit and rent for the entire lease term, or first month's rent, or whatever that might be. Usually it's, you can only hold rent for the entire lease term if the lease is at least 6 months. But you could be like, hey, we want the security deposit, and if they're paying $2,000 a month, we want an additional $6,000 held in escrow. Now we've bypassed the rent for the entire term because we are staying 3 months, right? So whatever that might be. So that's the workaround there. Other per escrow instructions paid out of seller's proceeds. Any questions about number 3, escrow payments? That's just what's coming out of the seller's proceeds. All right. Check that out. All right. Rent shall mean all monetary obligations of tenant to housing provider under the terms of this agreement, except security deposit. Tenant agrees to pay blank per month for the term of the agreement, right? This is where you're going to fill in how much do they pay per month? $2,500 per month for the term of the agreement. Rent is due, and that's per month, so it would be prorated. We'll calculate that here in a second. Rent is payable in advance on the first day of each calendar month and is delinquent the next day. So the default is it's due on the first and delinquent on the next. If commencement date falls on any day other than the day rent is payable under 4B, the first of the month, the tenant has and tenant has paid 1 full month of rent in advance of commencement date, rent for the second calendar month shall be prorated based on a 30-day period. So if they're going to take possession of the property on the 15th of June, which means day one starts on the 16th of June, and they pay the full $2,500, we're going to take that $2,500 and for the second month. So the rent that's due on the second month would be 2,500 divided by 30 times 15. And then you could subtract that amount from the second month's rent payment because they paid for a full month. So the easiest way around that is if our rent term is going to begin on the 15th, then we may want to make the rent due on the 15th of each month. Okay, otherwise you're going to prorate that second month. Does that make sense to everybody?
Why did you said you take the 2,500 divided by
30.
Why did
there's oh, go ahead.
Why did you times it by 15 after?
Oh, because we're saying that the close of escrow was on 6/15. So we would take 2,500 and divide it by 30.
Which is $83.33.
2,500, yeah, divided by 30, right? So that 33, 33, and then you would times it by the days they utilized in the first month. So if our rent was due on the 1st and they paid a full month's worth of rent, then come July 1st, instead of another 2,500 being due, if our rent was due on the 1st,
gotcha, half the month.
Half the month, yes, because they already stayed half a month. So then we take that 83 times 15, and they would owe for the month of July, they would owe $1,250 for the month of July. And that would have been, you know, by the time you get to the end of July, they would have paid for a month and a half worth of rent, basically. So you just prorate it. So that's why I'm saying if they're going to take possession in like the middle of the month, you may want to make rent due on the middle of the month. It's a little more complicated to make sure they pay it, but it makes it easier for calculation purposes that, hey, you get to stay from today until the end. Anyways, you can decide how to run that. Payment is C. Okay. Payment, the rent shall be paid by personal check, money order, cashier's check, or through escrow. So if we were holding it through escrow, we just check this box here for paragraph 3. Wire or electronic payment or other. This is where you could put like Venmo, right? So if they were going to pay it through Venmo or maybe Zelle or whatever, you could mark it there. Payment via electronic apps such as PayPal, Venmo, will or will not be accepted. So that's where they will be accepted, right? We check that box if it's going to be through PayPal or Venmo or Zelle. If they're wiring or you want to check or a cashier's check, then you can check those boxes here. But most of the time, this gets handled through escrow unless they're going to stay for an extended period of time. Okay, but you still may want to check all other options that you would accept. Rent shall be delivered to, this is where you're going to put, hey, who gets the rent, right? It's usually one of the buyers, and you're going to put their phone number and then their current address, right? Or any other location subsequently specified by housing provider in writing to tenant. And if check, rent may be paid personally between the hours of blank and blank on the following days, right? So they can pay it personally or they need to mail it. You want to clarify that, and maybe you want, hey, it can only be dropped off in person between 10 and 6 to that address above, or maybe they're taking it's like a mailboxes, etc. store where there's set up with a mailbox. You can put it there, and it may be like Monday through Friday. Okay, so you can specify that as well. This is where you put like buyer 1 at, and there. All right, so you put the address in there. If any payment is returned for non-sufficient funds because tenant stops payment, then after that, housing provider may in writing require tenant to pay rent in cash for 3 months, and all future rent shall be paid by money order or cashier's check. So you can specify that, like, hey, if we get insufficient funds, then we can in writing require it to be paid in cash, and then all future payments be cashier's check, which verifies they have funds in their account. Any questions? Oh, and then E is rent payments received by housing provider shall be applied to the earliest amounts due or past due. So if they were past due and they made a payment, it gets played to the past due, and then it goes forward. Any questions about section 4? All right, section 5 is the security deposit. I'm just double checking something real quick. All right, perfect. Section 5 is the security deposit. Tenant agrees to pay blank as a security deposit. In general, the maximum allowable security deposit is 2 times the monthly rent in paragraph 4A if the property is provided unfurnished, and 3 times the rent if provided furnished with housing provider's personal property. If a security deposit exceeds these amounts, buyer or housing provider and seller tenant are advised to discuss with a qualified real estate attorney. Security deposit will be paid by either personal check, money order, cashier's check, or through escrow. Most of the time, this is held through escrow, and you can decide on that security deposit. Oftentimes, it's like equal to 1 month's rent, but it could max out at 2 times. So you could have a security deposit of $5,000 for the max of a $2,500 security deposit or rental contract. Usually held through escrow. Or it could be held in owner's bank broker's trust account. We don't do that. Transferred and held by the owner of the premises. So if we hold it through escrow, if it's paid through escrow, then you're going to say, well, how do we want to manage? Well, no matter how it's the security deposit, how do you want to hold it? Right. So regardless of how it's paid, whether it's personal check, money order, cashier's check, or through escrow, the security deposit will be either transferred and held by the owner of the premises or held in the owner's broker's trust account. So you have to specify which you want to do. Generally speaking, we release this to the owner of the premises. So, right, so that would get transferred to the buyers of the property. They would hold that security deposit. All or any portion of the security deposit may be used as reasonably necessary to cure a tenant's default in payment of rent, which includes late charges, NSF fees, or sums due, repair damage, excluding ordinary wear and tear caused by tenant or by guest, invitee, or licensee of the tenant, clean premise if necessary upon termination of the tenancy, and replace or return personal property or appurtenances. Security deposit shall not be used by tenant in lieu of payment of last month's rents. If all or any portion of the security deposit is used during the tenancy, tenant agrees to reinstate the total security deposit within 5 days after written notice is delivered to tenant. Within 21 days after tenant vacates the premises, housing provider shall furnish tenant an itemized statement indicating the amount of any such security deposit received and the basis for its disposition and supporting documents as required by California Civil Code, and return any remaining portion of the security deposit to tenant. So, right, so it's just saying that, hey, if tenant vacates within 21 days, the buyer's either going to return that security deposit to the tenant, or they're going to provide an itemized detail with proof of what that security deposit went to and return any remaining unused portion. Have a fabulous day, Tracy. Okay. So that is the security deposit. C is security deposit will not be returned until all tenants have vacated the premises and all keys returned. Any security deposit returned by check shall be made out to tenant's name on this agreement or as subsequently modified. No interest will be paid on security deposit unless required by local law. If the security deposit is held by owner, tenant agrees not to hold broker responsible for its return. If the security deposit is held by in owner's broker's trust account and broker's authority is terminated before the expiration of this agreement and the security deposit is released to someone other than the tenant, then broker shall notify tenant in writing where and to whom the security deposit has been released. Once the tenant has been provided such notice, tenant agrees not to hold broker responsible for the security deposit. You could, on the other line, just so you know, when we get to the end of the contract, if you wanted it not to be released to the buyer, you didn't want to hold it in the broker's trust account, which we don't ever, never, ever, then you could always specify like deposit to be held in escrow. And if it's not going to be like a super long, like we're not talking like 6, 8, 9 months of rentals, if we're just like 42 days, like a month and a half or 2 months, you could hold it in escrow. Escrow is willing to hold it for that period of time. So you could specify on this in the other section that the deposit to be held in escrow. Any questions on the security deposit section 5? All right. Late charge, return checks. Tenant acknowledges that either late payment of rent or issuance of a return check, NSF, may cause the housing provider to incur costs and expenses, the exact amounts of which are extremely difficult and impractical to determine. These costs may include, but are not limited to, processing, enforcement, and accounting expenses, and late charges imposed by housing provider. If any installment of rent from tenant is not received by housing provider within 5 calendar days after date due, or if a check is returned, tenant shall pay housing provider respectively an additional sum of, right? So you may want to change this to like, hey, if it's not paid within 1 calendar days after due date, they're going to get an additional charge of $150 or blank percent. It could be 10% of the rent if you wanted to do it that way. Of the rent due as a late charge, and $25 as an NSF fee, right? Non-sufficient fund fee for the first return check, and $35 as an NSF fee for each additional return check, either of both which shall be deemed additional rent. Okay. So, right, it's 25 for an NSF and 35 for each additional. For the late charge, you could make it 10% or a flat fee. Housing provider and tenant agree that these charges represent fair and reasonable estimates of the cost housing provider may incur by reason of tenant's late or NSF payment. Any late charge or NSF fee due shall be paid with the current installment of rent. Housing provider's acceptance of any late charge or NSF fee shall not constitute a waiver as to any default of the tenant. Housing provider's right to collect a late charge or NSF fee shall neither be deemed an extension of the date rent is due under paragraph 3, nor prevent housing provider from exercising any other rights and remedies under this agreement as provided by law, right? Like kicking somebody out of the property. Any questions about section 6, late charge or return checks? Notice this is very similar to the seller in possession. It just goes into more detail and you have a little bit more leadway as to what you can do in order to remedy a scenario. All right, section 7 is parking. Check A or B. Please don't check both. Parking is permitted as follows is the first one. The right to park is or is not included in the rent charge pursuant to paragraph 4. If not included in the rent, the parking rental fee shall be an additional blank per month. Parking spaces are to be used for parking properly registered or operable motor vehicles, except for trailers, boats, campers, buses, or trucks. Other than pickup trucks, tenant shall park in assigned spaces only. Parking spaces are to be kept clean. Vehicles leaking oil, gas, or other motor vehicle fluid shall not be parked on the premises. Mechanical work or storage of inoperable vehicles or storage of any kind is not permitted in parking spaces or elsewhere on the premises, except as specified in paragraph 8. Any kind is not permitted in park. Oh, I already did that. All right. Right. So that would be parking is permitted, or parking is not permitted on the property of which the premise is part. So, right, this would be like, can they park in the garage and the driveway? Okay. If they can't park in the garage or the driveway, or it's a condo and there's not parking, then is it included or not? B would be parking is not permitted. They can't park. So for the most part, we're going to mark A. Parking is permitted as follows in garage and driveway. Right? The right to park is included in the rent for the most cases in our area. Okay, that's kind of what our default would be. Any questions about 7, parking? 8 is storage. Storage is permitted as follows, right? In designated storage areas. Right? The right to storage is or is not included in the rent charge pursuant to paragraph 4. If not included, the rent storage space fee shall be an additional blank per month. Tenant shall store only personal property tenant owns and shall not store property claimed by another or in which another has any right, title, or interest. Seller or tenant shall not store any improperly packaged food or perishable goods, flammable materials, explosive, hazardous waste, or other inherently dangerous materials or illegal substances. Right. So for the most part, we're going to say, hey, storage is permitted in designated storage areas and storage is included in the rent. Okay. Except for tenant's personal property would be B, contained entirely within the premise. Storage is not permitted on the premise. Right. So you could, anyways, it's either A or B, but there's no boxes there to check A or B. There probably should be. There's not. Any questions on section 8? All right. If you wanted it to be B, well, you would just say it's not included in the rent. I don't know. It's always included until they add boxes here. Utilities, tenant agrees to pay for all utilities and services and the following charges, except, right? So you have including additional charges here, and then except would be here, which shall be paid for by the housing provider or as agreed on a separate addendum. So there's a little extra caveat there that you could check that box. If any utilities are not separately metered, tenant shall pay tenant's proportional share as reasonably determined and directed by housing provider. Housing provider is only responsible for installing and maintaining one usable phone jack and one telephone line to the premises. Most normal houses don't have phone jacks anymore, so they probably should revamp this. Anyways, they're utilities. They're going to continue to pay for utilities. Water submeters, water use on the property is measured by a submeter, and tenant will be separately billed for water usage based on submeter. See attached water submeter. We don't usually have to worry about that. They're just going to get charged by their water meter. Gas meter. Premises does not have a separate gas meter, so most of our houses are going to have a separate gas meter. We don't have to worry about that. And same thing with the electric meter. The premise does not have a separate electrical meter. So if any of those were true, you would check the box there. Condition of premise. Any questions on section 9? All right, section 10, condition. The tenant has examined the premises, and if any, all furniture, furnishings, appliances, landscaping, fixtures, including smoke alarms and carbon monoxide detectors that are owned by housing provider, check all that apply. Tenant acknowledges that these items are in a condition disclosed and agreed to be delivered in the purchase agreement, right? Tenant acknowledges these items are clean and operable condition with the following exceptions. Tenant acknowledges the condition of these items contained in an attached statement of conditions, car form MII. Housing provider will deliver to tenant a statement of condition, that same form, within 3 days after execution of this agreement. Prior to commencement date, within 3 days after commencement date, tenant shall complete and return the MII to the housing provider within 3 days after delivery. Tenant's failure to return the form within that time shall be conclusively be deemed tenant's acknowledgement for the conditions stated in the MII, or tenant will provide housing provider a list of items that are damaged or not in operable condition within 3 days after commencement date, not as a contingency of this agreement, but rather as an acknowledgement of the condition of the premise. Or F is other. For the most part, you're going to check this box here. Tenant acknowledges that these items are in the condition disclosed and agreed to be delivered in the purchase agreement. Okay. 10 is usually A. Any questions about the other options on 10? 11 is maintenance. And yeah, I just made it bigger for you. Maintenance use and reporting. Tenant shall properly use, operate, and safeguard premises, including, if applicable, any landscaping, furniture, furnishings, and appliances, and all medical, electrical, gas, and plumbing fixtures, carbon monoxide detectors, and smoke alarms, and keep them and the premise clean, sanitary, and well ventilated. Tenant shall be responsible for any additional phone lines beyond the one line and jack that housing provider shall provide and maintain. Tenant shall replace any burned out or malfunctioning light bulbs. Tenant shall immediately notify housing provider in writing of any problem, malfunction, or damage with any item, including carbon monoxide detectors or smoke alarms on the property. Tenant shall be charged for all repairs and replacements caused by tenant's pets, guests, or licensees of the tenant, excluding ordinary wear and tear. Tenant shall be charged for damage to the premise as a result of failure to report a problem in a timely manner. Tenant shall be charged for repair of drain blockages or stoppages unless caused by defective plumbing parts or tree roots invading sewer lines. Housing provider, tenant, or HOA shall water the garden, landscaping, trees, shrubs, except. So for the most part, you're going to check the box there for tenant is going to maintain the landscaping. Any questions about section 11A and B? All right. C is housing provider, tenant, or HOA shall maintain the garden, landscaping, trees, and shrubs, etc. I don't know why there's two options there, except for maybe one's the front yard and one's the backyard. So you might say, hey, tenant at the HOA shall water the garden, landscaping, trees, except backyard. So maybe the HOA covers the front yard. And then maybe the tenant is going to provide that for the backyard. So you'd say except front yard. Right? So the HOA is going to maintain the water garden, landscaping, trees and shrubs except backyard, and the tenant's going to maintain the garden, landscaping, trees, shrubs except for the front yard. So that could be why there's two, one for the front yard and one for the backyard. There's an additional line here for either housing provider or tenant shall maintain if there's additional items there. Maybe it's, well, we'll get into that here in a second. Housing provider and tenant shall agree that state and local water use restrictions shall supersede any obligation of housing provider or tenant to water maintain any garden, landscaping, trees, shrubs pursuant to paragraphs 11B, C, and D. Tenant's failure to maintain any item for which the tenant is responsible shall give housing provider the right to hire someone to perform such maintenance and charge the tenant to cover the cost of such maintenance. Personal property belonging to the seller at the close of escrow of the purchase of the premises and following items are included in the premises without warranty, and housing provider will not maintain, repair, or replace them except, right? So personal property belonging to the seller at close of escrow are included for use of the premises without warranty. It's the seller's items. Tenant understands that if the premise is located in a common interest development, housing provider may not have authority or control over a certain part of the premises, such as roof, electrical, gas, plumbing, features inside certain walls in common areas, such as shared parking or parking structure or garage. Tenant shall not use the premise to plant, grow, cultivate, or sell marijuana except. Okay. Any questions about the remainder of section 11? All right. Keep in mind here that we're going to skip down to the other section. Should be at the end. Other material facts, other documents. Let's see. Trying to find a good place to put this. Oh, here's just other right here, other terms and conditions. Here, just so you guys know, I would put seller will not provide nor maintain phone line to property. PROPERTY. Just because it's mentioned several times in that top section, I would want to mention it under section 42 that, hey, we're not going to provide or maintain a phone line for the property. Just so this, actually it wouldn't be seller, sorry, it'd be housing provider, because it would actually be the buyer, housing provider will not provide nor maintain phone line to the property. Okay, so I'd make sure to include that on my RLAS because it's mentioned multiple times. Okay. Continuing on, that was section 11. 12 is neighborhood conditions. The tenant is advised to satisfy himself or herself as to neighborhood and area conditions, including but not limited to schools, proximity and adequacy of law enforcement, crime statistics, proximity of registered felons or offenders, fire protection, and other governmental services, availability, adequacy of cost of any wired, wireless, internet connections, or other telecommunications or other technology services and installations, proximity to a commercial, industrial, or agricultural activities, existing and proposed transportation, construction, and development that may affect noise, view, or traffic, airport noise or odor from any source, wild and domestic animals, other nuisances, hazards, or circumstances, cemeteries, facilities, and condition of common areas, conditions and influence of significant or certain cultures and or religions, and personal needs, requirements, and preferences of the tenant. Keep in mind, your tenant should be happy with the property. They've been living in it already. So this is just to clarify to like set the buyer free as the new housing provider of any legalities there. Pets, unless otherwise provided in the California Civil Code or other law, no animal or pet shall be kept on or about the premise without the housing provider's written consent, except as agreed to on the pet addendum. So if they have pets, you want to make sure to include that form PET, the pet addendum. Okay, smoking, the tenant is responsible for all damage caused by smoking after the close of escrow or during the term of this agreement. Any prior damage that has been accounted for in the purchase agreement shall not be deducted from any security deposit. The premises of common areas may be subject to local non-smoking ordinance. No smoking of any substance is allowed on the premise or common areas. If smoking does occur on the premise or common areas, tenant is in material breach of this agreement. Tenant, guests, or others may be required to leave the premise Or you could say smoking of the following substances is allowed. So if your seller is a smoker, they've already been smoking in the properties, you may want to put like cigarettes here. I don't even know how to spell good. Cigarettes outside only, or in garage only, or whatever, cigarettes, right? So you could clarify there if they are already smokers. Any questions about 12, 13, or 14? All right, rules and regulations. Tenants agree to comply with all housing provider rule and regulations that are at any time posted on the premises or delivered to tenant. Tenant shall not and shall ensure that guests, invitees, and licensees of the tenant shall not disturb, annoy, endanger, or interfere with other tenants of the building or neighbors, or use of the premise for any unlawful purposes under federal, state, or local law, including but not limited to using, manufacturing, selling, storing, transporting illicit drugs or other contraband, or violate any ordinance or commit a waste or nuisance about the premise. If applicable, check 1 for B, housing provider shall provide tenant with a copy of the rules and regulations, blank days or on a specific date is 1, or tenant has been provided and acknowledges a receipt of the copies and rules and regulations. Here, this is where on like 42, you could come down here and put we're almost there. No additional rule 80. Rules. I can't spell at all. Okay. So you could clarify down there that there's no additional rules and regulations, but this would be like if it's an HOA, you'd provide them a copy of the HOA rules and regs, which they should have already gotten because they provided it to your buyer as part of the transaction. Let's see. 16, if it's a condominium, you would check that box here. The premises are in a unit in a condominium planned unit development, common interest subdivision, or other development governed by homeowners association. The name of the HOA is blank. Tenant agrees to comply with all HOA covenants, conditions, and restrictions, bylaw rules, regulations, and decision. HOA tenant agrees to HOA rules. Tenant shall reimburse housing provider for any fines or charges imposed by the HOA or other authorities due to any violation by tenant or guests or licensees of tenant, or housing provider shall have the right to deduct such amounts from the security deposit. Tenant acknowledges already having a copy of the HOA rules. Okay. 17, alterations and repairs unless otherwise specified by law or paragraph 24C without housing provider's prior written consent. Tenant shall not make any repairs, alterations, or improvements in or about the premises, including painting, wallpapering, adding or changing locks, installing antenna or satellite dishes, placing signs, displays, or exhibits, or using screws, fastening devices, large nails, or adhesive materials. Housing provider shall not be responsible for the cost of alterations or repairs made by tenant. Tenant shall not deduct from the rent any cost of any repairs, alterations, or improvements, and any deduction made by tenant shall be considered unpaid rent. Section 17. 18 is keys, locks, and items included. How many keys to the premises are included? How many keys to the mailbox, keys to the common area, remote devices, and other items. You should be able to copy that right off whatever they put in the seller property questionnaire. The tenant acknowledges that the locks to the premises have not or been rekeyed or have been rekeyed. For the most part, they have not because they're remaining in possession. If tenant rekeys existing locks or opening devices, tenant shall immediately deliver copies of all keys to housing provider. Tenant shall pay all costs and charges related to any loss of keys or opening devices. Tenant may not remove locks even if installed by tenant. Tenant shall provide housing provider keys and other items necessary to access the property as required in the purchase agreement at close of escrow or if checked at end of residential lease after sale. So it defaults to close of escrow there because if this is like a longer in possession, I usually leave that as at close of escrow. My buyers get a key to that property. However, if we're talking it's like 60 days or less, I may go ahead and say, hey, they get it at the end of the residential lease. I kind of treat it the same as a seller in possession there on D. Items included, other items included in the purchase agreement shall be provided at the end of the residential lease after sale is the end of 18. Any questions there on 16, 17, or 18? We may wrap up and postpone the remainder of this, unless you guys are good to continue on. Do we get a thumbs up for we should continue on, or should we postpone it until next Thursday?
Postpone till next Thursday.
Marciel says postpone. All right. We are going to pick up, because it's a nice clean break, on page 4 of 16, entry section 19. We'll pick that up next Thursday. We'll start with that, and then we'll go over whatever new forms we're supposed to be covering next Thursday, so that we don't drag on forever. However, most of the information is completed. It's just kind of the legal jargon moving on from here. So it won't take us very long to cover the rest, but we will cover that next Thursday. So we'll have part 1 of the RLAS and part 2 of the RLAS. Does anybody have any additional questions up to section 18 or on the SIP at this time before we wrap up for the day?
No.
Fabulous. If you don't have any questions, you can go ahead and click on that link in the chat box so you can log your attendance for today. Make sure you log any additional trainings that you would like to see as we're getting ready to set up our fall schedule. Fabulous. I hope everyone has a great day. Thank you for allowing me to go over just a little bit so I can get to a clean break. And again, we'll pick up section 19 of the RLAS next Thursday at 9 a.m. I look forward to seeing you next week, and have a fabulous weekend.